Thank you. And thank you, Tina. And thank you again as well for your leadership. I think bringing us all together is really powerful. I think there's some amazing synergies across all the papers today. So thanks, Tina. Today I'm going to talk about a population and a site of care which is really under-examined in terms of continence care. And this is work I've carried out with Andy Northcott, who's also in the audience with us today, and a wider group of co-applicants as well. So, people live with dementia in the hospital setting. Well, people with dementia are one of the largest populations in our hospitals. It's a key site of care. They occupy between 25 and 50% of all our hospital beds internationally. They're not there because of their dementia. They're there because they have an additional acute condition which needs specialist care. Typically an infection, a UTI, a fracture. So they need that specialist setting, but also these are treatable conditions. So this population should be going home. However, they have one of the worst outcomes within the acute setting, with over a quarter of that population dying during their admission. And if you can compare two patients admitted for the same condition, the person living with dementia will have twice the risk of dying during their admission. And we've known this for a long time. So there's a large body of evidence, public inquiries, reports that tell us again and again about these poor outcomes and experiences. And this tells us a couple of really important things. It tells us that there's something deeply systemic about the inequalities this population experience in our hospitals, but also that it seems incredibly resistant to change. We've known about it, yet we still have these poor outcomes and experiences. These inquiries and reports also tell us that culture of care is critical. Critical as a cause of these inequalities, but also as a point, an opportunity for change. Continence care is something that crops up again and again in these inquiries and reports as of significance in these poor experiences and outcomes. In terms of the UK situation, the NHS response has been very organisational and reactive in its response to these poor outcomes and experiences, tending to focus on organisational features of care that can potentially be transformed. However, these approaches fail to examine everyday care, everyday organisation and delivery of care at the bedside. And that's the area that we focus on. Continence care, again, is of significance here. This type of care is often seen as basic rather than essential or dignity care. It's also work within this setting which is often seen as being of low status and is often gendered. It's also a setting where we see an incredibly high use of pads, continence technologies. High use in the care of older people and people living with dementia, but also high inappropriate use. Also, all of these pads and a huge amount of the continence products, the majority, are disposable within this setting. And our approach is that if we want to examine this and want to change it, we have to look at work as done rather than work as imagined by the NHS or organisational levels. We need to look at care practices. In response, Andy and I and our colleagues have carried out and are carrying out a programme of research examining everyday care, the organisation and delivery of care at the bedside to people living with dementia. In our first study looking at resistance and refusal of care, we really started to identify continence as a key issue to follow up. For us, it was something that we saw was a massive aspect of everyday care practices and the work of the wards, but was very invisible. And as we've seen in our other presenters so far today, highly undiscussable, a very undiscussable issue, very silenced work and very hidden work, but it's everywhere. So our second study, we focused on continence care. We've been funded by Department of Health and Social Care to examine this, and we've just finalised our report on that topic. Andy and I carry out detailed sociological ethnographic research, spending detailed time in wards with care teams, ward teams, observing everyday care. We've carried out work in 16 wards across 8 hospitals across England and Wales. And we're just going to present a tiny part of our findings. We have a huge amount of data, a huge amount of findings, but our key finding I want to share with you today is that we identified pad cultures. And by pad cultures, we mean that we identified the routine use of continence pads in the care of a wider group of continent people living with dementia. Pads were used regardless of their continence and independence across these wards for all people living with dementia, but also for a wider group of older people. The rationale for their use was around a precautionary strategy used as a safeguard to ensure containment of continence and to prevent accidents. However, over time, we saw that this culture, this approach to continence care, extended from just their use to contain, but to become something that people were expected to use the pads. So continent people were expected to use pads within the acute setting. And here's an example. We have so many examples within our data of this, but I think it shows some of the key social processes that we identified. People living with dementia would communicate their continence needs, either verbally or embodied, their urgency. But for staff, the response was very much about containment within the pad, for containment at the bedside and in the bed. You have a pad on, use it. And we saw this again and again in our data. And of course, these have a huge number of implications and impacts on patients, but also on staff. And I'm just going to run through a few examples of how this impacts on people living with dementia. It really impacts on understanding of the person and has long-term implications for people. So the use of pads turned into something that meant that walking to the bathroom was seen as something that should be prevented. If someone was walking to the bathroom, it was very much understood by staff as risky, a falls risk, and also wandering, and was something that would be prevented. Resistance to intimate care, which was often described to patients as a little wash down below, could quickly become interpreted by staff as aggression, and that person could be labelled an aggressive person. Forms of embodied communication of continence needs could also be viewed as transgressive. As we saw an example before, a person trying to take off a continence pad because of that urgency and that urgent need could quickly be seen as transgressive, and staff would focus on stopping that behaviour. All of these things could start to mean the individual could be viewed as either living with dementia or someone who is at a later stage of their dementia, which could, of course, have significant consequences for their future care trajectory, and whether they could go home or not. We also identified pads went beyond being a containment practice, but became a restrictive practice, enabling staff to contain people not only in a pad, but in the chair, but also within the bed. It also meant that any urgency of the person could be also contained within the timetables of care within the ward. Ward staff would tell us again and again that they saw continence care as a heavy burden, a heavy load. They also talked about how they really wanted to work in different ways, but felt that organisationally this was not possible for them. Institutionally, we saw that continence care was invisible, and there was no indication in these hospitals that they viewed continence care as having implications for care quality. So how can we transform this? Well, we've got a lot of data, a lot of findings. We're working with policy, we're working on training, and we're also working with hospitals and wards to think about how we can shift these cultures of care. We've obtained just in excess of £1 million to look at restrictive practices in more detail, and continence care is one of those, and pad practices as part of that. Our wider story is in our open access publication you can download called Wandering the Wards, and thank you for your time.